Hi everyone, so today we're going to go through AQA A-Level Sociology Paper 1, and that is Education with Theory and Methods. In this video we'll just be looking at education, and I'm going to do a part 2 for theory and research methods, because otherwise this video would just be way too long, and I won't be able to go into them in detail, which I want to do. Before I start, I just want to say that I'm not like an educated professional. I am going to sit my exams this year, like many of you will be. And I just thought I'd do this video for the sake of my own revision, but also to help other people. So we can all go back over this video and our last moments of panicking. Like, ah! So I'm going to try and do it in 60 minutes, but we'll see how that goes. So if you don't know already, this is what the paper looks like. So it's 80 marks overall, and you have 2 hours to complete it. The first section, which is education, which we'll be going through now, is worth 50 marks, and there's 4 questions. And then in the other paper, you have your methods and context and your theory and methods question. So this is what the AQA spec says that we need to learn for, the exam. But it looks quite confusing and complicated. You can pause it and read through it if you'd like. But I've broken it down into 8 different topics to make it easier. You might get this taught differently, but this is how I've been taught it, so I've just chose to, do it this way because it's easiest for me. So the first topic we're going to look at is functionalism, and we're going to start that off with social solidarity, and of course it's Durkheim, because Durkheim, he has a lot to say, doesn't he? So Durkheim believes that education socialises people to teach them shared norms and values to maintain social solidarity. And social solidarity is just the idea that all members of society feel together as part of something bigger. So it's that sense of like community. So if you're looking at it within a school, that would be like assemblies, homework, uniform, and attendance. Because again, it's providing that togetherness. So looking at assemblies on its own, we can understand that they're like a shared space where you talk topics, or all the different year groups will sit down. Like, you have the little ones at the front and the year sixes at the back on the benches, thinking they're all cool. But you're all together in that moment, listening to a message, whether that be like a remembrance ceremony or sports awards, or things like Star of the Week, where it's celebrating and it's bringing everyone together. However, Marxists would argue that schools are ideologically driven, indoctrinating students into passive acceptance of rules, and assemblies, in fact, provide us with false consciousness. And then we have Parsons. He's another one who likes to open his mouth a lot, isn't he? So he talks about bridge theory and meritocracy. Parsons believes that school is a bridge between the family and wider society. Home teaches particularistic standards, but school teaches universalistic standards to prepare individuals to enter the workplace. And the easier way to remember this, because there's a lot of key terms in sociology, is to break it down. So your particular is your individual, like just you, or like compared to your siblings. So you might have different standards, for example, like at home, whereas universal is collective, so it might be the classroom standards, for example. The family helps to fix status at birth, which is your ascribed status, whereas education helps students to achieve status. Their future roles are determined, by how hard they work at school. Education is arguably meritocratic. And of course, meritocracy, another key term, it's basically a system where social advancement is based on your individual talent, effort, and achievement rather than social class, wealth, or external factors. So it's the idea if you work hard at school, it'll pay off and you'll do well in life. You can get good jobs, but it all starts from school and getting those good grades. However, not all students have equal chance of succeeding at school, and you should consider like parental involvement, disabilities, social class, gender, catchment areas, and things like that, and how they can impact an individual's education. And of course, Marxists would argue that meritocracy is a myth. Okay, so Parsons yet again specialised skills. School teaches us skills which are required for a specific future occupation so that we can play our specific role in society to maintain consensus. For example, to become a nurse in school, there are subjects such as maths, so you're reading dosages for prescriptions and things like that. English for your communication skills with the patients, and health and social care can be for like your employability and things like that, and knowing how to work in those scenarios. And a criticism of this would be skills are still required beyond GCSEs to do these jobs. So it's not as easy as just doing your GCSEs and getting a job and thinking everything's happy and jolly. Because actually, might need like training or a degree, things like that, which is also more costs. Davis and Moore discuss role allocation. So role allocation is basically how education shows us who are the best people for the best jobs and roles in society by sieving those high achievers to the tops. So just think of like a sieve, you know, the pit like parts fall through, but then the good bits might stay at the top. So say if you're like sieving for gold, for example, I don't know, like the mud might go through the bottom, but those golden students stay at the top. School allocates students via awards and certificates and the exam system, which is designed to encourage competition, individual achievement, and hard work. However, Marxists and feminists would argue that we all aren't given the same opportunity to succeed. Middle/upper class white middle-aged men have historically and continue to dominate powerful jobs and roles in society. And also, we can discuss who actually defines these jobs as better than the others. So you might say, okay, you have a heart surgeon who obviously has a lot of respectability and gets paid a lot because of that role, and people see it as it's important. But then you may have like a bin man, for example, who is just seen as like a low paid working class job, where actually, if you're looking like historically, if you didn't have people providing those cleaning services, then we'd all be like disease ridden and things like that. Okay, so we're now going to evaluate functionalist ideas on education. So you have the new right support the ideas of functionalists and believe that meritocracy makes people responsible for their own achievements. So new rights are very big on individualism, if you don't put the work in and you don't succeed, that's your fault. It's not the government, it's not the state. It's the idea of like individual rather than collectivism. So they like functionalist ideas. And having meritocracy, it helps people to work hard, reducing the burden on the state and unemployment benefit. So if you're driving to work hard and you end up working hard and getting a good job, that's less people the state needs to look after, basically. Criticisms of the functionalist approach, it's arguably very rose tinted, and like I say, when you're looking at meritocracy, it isn't actually all equal, and it can overlook racism, sexism, middle class bias, disabilities, things like that. And also, we don't all have shared norms and values, as we're a multicultural society increasingly. So you can't just generalise and say, right, guys, everyone needs to be following these values. And I'm going to talk later about British values, how that links in and things like that. So that's a little teaser. Also, education does not always teach us the specialised skills which we need for work. Again, like it was saying, you might need further training or things like that to progress into the chosen career that you want. Moving swiftly on our next topic, we've got Marxism and education. So first, we're going to talk about how Althusser says that education is an ideological state apparatus. So for those who don't know, an ideological state apparatus is a part of society which keeps the bourgeoisie in power by reproducing and justifying inequalities. So an example of this would be the education system, but then you can also have like the media, criminal justice system, things like that, like across the other topics of sociology. So specifically, education reproduces inequalities through unequal access to resources, a curriculum that may not reflect diverse backgrounds, which is known as ethnocentric curriculum, and the hidden curriculum that transmits social norms and expectations. And further support for education being an ideological state apparatus is that the government has actually made it illegal for teachers to promote anti-capitalist views, proving that education is a tool used by the bourgeoisie to protect capitalism. Marxists also discuss specialised skills, but it differs from functionalism in the aspect that functionalists believe that it's based on your talents and your skills into which jobs you go into, whereas Marxists believe that your skills are actually predetermined on your social class and the labels people have provided on you, and therefore upward social mobility is actually limited and you're very restricted in that aspect. Yet it can be argued that this perspective is too critical, and then people do in fact overcome those labels and do enter high-paid jobs. And feminists, would argue that Marxism overlooks gender inequality and social mobility. So those who actually achieve social mobility, feminists would argue it's harder for women due to concepts such as the glass ceiling, because basically the glass ceiling is like the idea of like you can see the job roles at the top, but you can't physically get to them. That glass is stopping you from breaking through. Meritocracy, again, as we've mentioned, Marxists believe that meritocracy is a myth, that a person's social class is more likely to get them a job than their grades. This might be due to like social connections, and we'll go on to like capital later on when we're talking about that. So an example is that working class students are disadvantaged since 90% of Ofsted failing schools are in deprived areas. Poor Ofsted's rating may lead to problems like recruiting the best teachers. So even if students work hard in lessons, not having a specialist teacher may have a negative impact on their grades. So for example, in my school, I think it was like year 8, we had a PE teacher teaching maths, so obviously that wasn't the highest quality of learning that we could have received. So next we have Bowles and Gintis's correspondence principle. This refers to the way we learn things in school, correspond/mirror the way we are expected to behave and work. This is achieved through the hidden curriculum. These are lessons which are taught to us but not specifically referred to on the curriculum. So here's some examples here. I won't read them out. I'll let you pause the video as it'll be too long if I just go through everything. But within education, basically students are taught to be passive and obedient. Therefore, they don't rebel as they are unaware of their exploitation because it's so ingrained in all these not values, like the way we are socialised, that's the word, helps to indoctrinate these ideas into us. So this actually leads us nicely onto the idea of indoctrination. So it is believed that pupils are brainwashed by ruling classes to be the ideal workers. Yet again, students are taught to be obedient and passive, and students don't see this exploitative nature as they are socialised to respect authority. This also leads to the idea of false consciousness, that it's told that it's benefiting you and actually benefits the system. So students might be made to go to intervention sessions because it's like, oh guys, we'll help you get those grades, you'll get them passes. But actually it could just be helping them in the league tables look better. And Chomsky argues that school is a filtering system. The most compliant reach the top of politics, business and media and help protect the bourgeoisie, and the less compliant are made to internalise failure and end up in dead-end jobs. Because this is, so if they're able to support the capitalist system from a young age, they can go into those areas and dominate them and become wealthy and powerful and all those great things. Or is it so great? And now we're going to go into one of the main, when I said main studies of sociology. It's the one and only Paul Willis Learning to Labour study. So for those who don't know, neo-Marxist Paul Willis criticises the concept of brainwashing because many students rebel from education as a secondary agent of socialisation. So this is the study. Basically his study was looking at 12 working class boys in the Midlands, and they were part of an anti-school subculture, so they were engaged in behaviours such as like smoking, truanting, bullying, whether that have been like homophobia, sexism, things like that. So they were failing in school, so they chose to seek alternative means for status. So that's what he was investigating within his study, but it's very useful in terms of looking at not only rebelling from the norms, but also working class white boys' experience in education. Anyways, a whole range of academic subjects actively encourage students to think critically about society and their role of elites, so it can be argued that it's actually not indoctrinating us. So examples of this subject is sociology itself, like now we're discussing it and criticising it, history, English, media and critical thinking. Students are explicitly taught about features of the hidden curriculum, including enterprise days, and employability skills, etc. Bowles and Ginter's research is not representative of all Western schools, as it was carried out in only a few American high schools in the 1970s. Okay, so now we're going to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the Marxist approach. So a strength is that it exposes the myth of meritocracy and uses this concept to brainwash the exploited working class into accepting their status because of their own efforts and not the capitalist system. So it's diverting attention. It's like, oh, well, I haven't done well because I haven't tried. But actually, the capitalist system reinforces them to fail. And education is an ideological state apparatus legitimising capitalism through the formal and hidden curriculum. Paul Willis's research has also led on to people looking at gender, ethnicity, and class inequalities, so that's good. And a weakness is that Marxists don't agree on the way in which class inequality is achieved. So obviously, if they don't collectively agree, that weakens the argument because it's like, well, what do you actually believe? So Bowles and Ginters take a top-down structural approach and say that it's determined the outcomes because students are so passive and obedient that they become indoctrinated to the ideas, whereas Paul Willis actually argues that students are not passive and docile, they're actually active and can overcome this by rebelling. But yet his research doesn't reflect this, as there was no girls involved, so it can't be as representative. And then yet again, Marxism very class-centered and can ignore gender, sexuality, and ethnicity and how they play into place. Okay, so next we have my favourite topic. It was so hard to break this down as there's so many things I could talk about. I feel like I could do an hour video on this alone. But that is social policy and education. There's a lot to get through, but we're just going to get started. It's useful, I promise. Starting off with the 1944 Education Act. The features of this policy was that it introduced compulsory state education up to the age of 14, and that was a tripartite system of supposedly equal status schools, that's a key word, supposedly, and the three schools were grammar, secondary modern, and technical schools. Children would sit an IQ test at 11 that measured their innate ability, which was known as the 11 plus. And those that passed the 11 plus exam would go to grammar schools, which is approximately 20% of the students. Now, the aims of this policy, so obviously it was post-World War II, obviously Britain had been through a lot, and it was time to get back on our feet and rebuild the country again. So as part of the post-war welfare state, creating a land fit for heroes. And this was tackling, if you know William Beveridge's report, also known as the Beveridge Report, tackling the 5 evils, and this one specifically looks at ignorance. And they wanted to abolish inequality in state education. The 11 plus exam was seen as a fair and scientific way to measure ability that a child is born with. So that's like your innate abilities. So now it's time to evaluate. So her strength is that it provided upward social mobility for the working class children who pass the 11 plus. And it continues to provide high quality education for 5% of UK children that still go to a grammar school. However, when I said earlier that there were supposedly equal status schools, well actually, a criticism is that secondary modern and technical students were labelled failures and often not allowed to sit formal qualifications as a result of the labelling. So this wastes a lot of working class talent as they weren't given the chance. And they were labelled by, well, you're not going to the grammar school. Feminists were critical as there were fewer girls' grammar school places, meaning that girls required a higher pass rate than boys to attend. So obviously that's not equal nor meritocratic either, because it's like, well, hang on, girls have to get a higher score than boys. That isn't fair. So, moving on to 1965, we have the Comprehensive Education Act. So, comprehensive education abolished selection at the age of 11 and aimed to educate all children in the same secondary school regardless of their class, ethnicity, gender, or ability. The aims of the policy was basically that the tripartite system had not succeeded in creating equal opportunity. The Labour government were critical of a highly divisive tripartite system and that social mobility had actually stalled rather than improved. It was believed that the meritocratic ideals were more likely to occur in a comprehensive system where all children are given the same opportunity. So a strength of this is that it recognised that children actually do develop at different rates and some might be known as like late bloomers and can be in higher sets and streams later on, rather than choosing their so-called innate ability at 11 years old. Some weaknesses are that private schools still exist for the wealthy, which is about 7% of the UK children go to private schools. So yeah, again, there's still that division. And also 5% of students still go to grammar schools, so grammar schools are still in use. Not Marxist, sorry, the New Right were very critical of comprehensives, saying that they lacked discipline with students organising strike events. It was poor results, failed to prepare children for work, even though results had improved, and a lack of parental choice in schools. We'll go into that later, and the idea of parentocracy. Speaking more about the New Right, we have the Education Reform Act. So, features of this policy were testing, the national curriculum, league tables, and Ofsted was soon followed by this, and open enrolment. The aims of the policy link heavily to marketisation and that it would increase competition between schools. So this is the idea that schools run more like businesses to drive up the standards. Local authority run schools with failing children, and there was no incentive for schools to improve individually. So ultimately, school results did improve. As we can see by this table here, we have 1988 when it was introduced, and the level of A star to C grades was at 41.9. And then 1997, that's when the Labour Party came into power and the Conservative government obviously came to an end, was 54.4%. So obviously you can see there is a jump there. So it did in fact improve grades. However, there is still a significant gender, class and ethnicity disparity in the results. And also, testing increases stress on pupils, so that's obviously a negative. Because marketisation is like, right, it's drilling exam culture. So obviously you have your SATs in year 2, I believe, and then you have them again in year 6, and obviously GCSEs, A-levels, constant testing throughout school. Money is spent on marketing and not education. So for example, schools might advertise. So for example, schools love a good pen, a good branded pen. For what they're spending on pens, they could be putting it into their education. And there's more criticisms you can see there. Looking at the New Right a little bit more, we can see that marketisation, like I just said, is a process of introducing market forces on consumer choice and competition between suppliers into areas run by the state. Government policy since the 1988 Education Reform Act have had marketisation at the core. So we have Big Maggie, and the New Right were big on reduction in state control over education, increasing competition between and within schools, and greater parental choice of schools, which is known as parentocracy. So these were their 3 key aims. And here's an example of some of the policies. So we have the national curriculum, testing, like I said there, league tables, Ofsted, open admissions, things like that. And here we have, so you can see how students are silk shifted. So we have funding formulas based on the number of students a school attracts. So basically, like I said, the more students you have, the more funding they get. So you can see on the cycle here, the more funding, more facilities, to get better results. This keeps going round and round and round. And the students that threaten that will move to other schools. And the ones that, like a cream, the good part, to keep them, to keep boosting the school. Moving on, we have New Labour policy. So the New Labour was in power 1997 until 2010. So one of their aims was specialist schools. So quickly looking at them, there were schools that were supposedly expert in one of 10 subjects such as sports, business, maths and computing. The New Labour government was simply continuing the market force agenda, giving parents more choice over schools with the aim to drive up standards and parentocracy. The problem with specialist schools is that quite often they weren't actually specialist schools, and they just used the funding to improve that area. So for example, they could have had a really bad maths department, and They were like, right, well, we're going to become a maths specialist school. And they've improved that maths department, and it might just become average. But then they become labelled as a maths specialist school when actually they were just improving it. But that wasn't the intended purpose, obviously. Then we have city academies. City academies were introduced to improve standards in deprived working class inner city communities. The schools were provided with additional funding, superheads, and expert teachers. So these were often in areas that had working class and BAME communities, which is Black, Asian, Minority, and Ethnic. That, for those who don't know, communities who were underachieving. The schools were removed from failing local authority control and ran themselves independently with direct government funding. So a famous example of this would be Mossbourne Community Academy, which is in Hackney, London, I believe. And within 5 years, they managed to get 85% of the students to get A star to C grades. And I think within this school, they have like 40% of students on free school meals and things like that. So that's something to account for. Sure Start Centres. This is another big one from the New Labour. The centres offer childcare, play sessions, parenting advice, and employment coaching. And at their peak, there was 3,600 centres with a budget of about £1.8 billion. Student Start Centres were essentially designed to boost the reading age for children. So they found that there was an 18-month gap between learning between a working class compared to their middle class counterpart. However, middle class parents actually often hijacked. So they didn't literally go in and say hands up, you know what I mean? But like they basically abused this free system for the people who needed them most as a way of getting subsidised care for their children, which intimidated working class mothers and prevented them from actually taking their children there. So of course this led to the decline of Shooting Start centres. Then we have educational maintenance allowance. Educational maintenance allowance was paid to sixth form students between £10 to £30 a week for coming to college, meeting their deadlines and achieving good grades. The aim was to boost sixth form and university participation, especially that of working class students, and it helped drive up social mobility for these students. And the Labour government wanted to increase higher education participation to around 50%, and this is obviously a strength because it's given them money and helps them meet the free costs of education. Hidden costs of free education. Did I say that right? Anyways. Yeah, so they could help buy textbooks, travelling, things like that. But obviously there was no monitoring where this money was being spent. So it didn't have to actually be spent on educational resources. It could be spent on anything the students wanted to. Moving on to my final section of social policy, we have the conservative education policies. I should also mention, so there was a coalition government, and it was between the Conservative and Liberal Democrats between 2010 and 2015. And then 2015 to recently, 2024, it was the Conservative government in power. Just a little background details. So, trebling of tuition fees, we can blame the Conservative government for this. This was a marketisation policy. The government hoped that by changing tuition to £9,000 a year, that university stands would increase. So basically, the universities that were lower on the league tables wouldn't charge the full £9,000 because they were providing a lesser product. The education quality wasn't as high. However, as you'll know if you're applying for university yourself, all universities charge top whack, and obviously this was not intended. However, arguably, the number of first and 2-1 degrees awarded at universities are higher than ever, so that's something. So, now we have pupil premium. Pupil premium is additional funding given to schools to help improve the attainment of disadvantaged groups. So, those who are eligible are either in care, were adopted, on free school meals, or income support. Schools are given additional funding between £900 and £2,400 per student to help boost them because they're a part of a disadvantaged group. And there is a link between deprivation and underperformance at school, sorry. Got the hiccups. However, most parents don't actually know that their child is entitled to this money. And also, due to school funding cuts, this money hasn't actually been used per that individual child to help boost them, rather than all the children at the school to help assist that way. And then we have GCSE and A-level reforms since 2016. So prior to 2016, a lot of subjects actually had coursework, which has been removed because it's seen that schools were helping too much with coursework and rigging it. So it wasn't exactly fair, because obviously the schools want to be higher up in the league tables, so give the students a little nudge to get better results. So therefore they were more exam based, and exams were made more difficult to help compete for skills on the international stage. So there's things like the English baccalaureate, where you're told to do, your three core subjects, your language, your history, geography, things like that, like internationally recognised qualifications rather than like coursework subjects. However, a key term linking to crime is your strain theory, and this will be people innovate to achieve ultimate means. So if they can't achieve them through a proper way, they cheat to get up the league tables. We are now on to topic number 4. This is only a short one. What is globalisation? So Giddens refers to globalisation as the increasing interconnectedness of societies. Water adds to this by saying it is a social process in which constraints of geography on economic, political, social and cultural arrangements have declined. Oh, I didn't know I put a little spin in there. Sorry, that caught me off guard. Globalisation has been facilitated in the past with advances in traditional forms of communication, such as through television. However, more recently, due to the development of information technology, such as internet and social media, and also the acceleration in international migration. So what are the impacts of globalisation on education policy? So Kelly says that British education policy aims to allow the students to compete with international students, like what we said earlier. The British economy is global, and skilled workers are required to keep in the G7 as the richest nations. So that's basically the top 7 richest economically nations in the world. Michael Gove and the coalition government used Britain's foreign position on the PISA league tables, which is the programme for international students assessment. It's basically done every 3 to 5 years to see where each country ranks in terms of reading, writing and maths, I believe. So here we have the UK results. So we started at 25th under the Labour government, and then we moved to 22nd place with the coalition government, and to 14th place in 2018 with the Conservative government. So as you can see, it seems to be working. So what's the impact of globalisation on education policy? Again, arguably it has led to the commodification of students. So globalisation has led to the commodification of students, said by Ball. British universities compete to attract overseas students who pay higher fees. They have also set up universities overseas based on their British brands. Many British students study in foreign universities that specialise in certain fields. So, for example, you might go to a university in Germany because they're famously known for like the good engineering degrees, for example. A weakness of this, I forgot what to talk then, was that many British students go to university overseas because it is cheaper given the high cost of tuition in Britain. I think it's gone up to £9,535 now. Just went up again recently, hasn't it? But so yeah, students are being treated as a commodity to be bought and sold as profit. And this has led to 50% of UK students considering study abroad due to the cost, with 14% of them actually doing so and moving. But another good part of it is that it's led to a multicultural curriculum. So arguably earlier we were saying that the curriculum's actually heavily ethnocentric. But now we're driving towards a change. Schools must teach students about other faiths and cultures beyond the white. So 81% of the population in the UK is white and 11% being Christian, which is dominant. For example, RE lessons teach about world faiths such as Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, all those types of things. And geography lessons can teach about indigenous cultures. Multiculturalism has led to an increased emphasis of equality, and that's not just on obviously minority groups, it's also across other groups, such as special educational needs students, free school meal students, and English as additional language students. So those are the ones that speak English as a second language, or third, or fourth. I don't know, but yeah. And Ofsted targets these groups and looks at them when evaluating the performance of a school, as these are vulnerable groups. Linking to what I said earlier, the teachings suggest that they are distinct from international values linked to human rights. That was supposed to be British values, I missed it out. But here we have our British values for you don't know. Liberty, democracy, rule of law, mutual respect, and tolerance. We could arguably say, what is remotely British about them? Like, are they just not human rights? Are they just not basic values that you should have? But again, we love to brand them as British values. British! Topic number 5. We're getting there, guys. International school relationships and processes. Starting off with a hidden curriculum. We alluded to this a bit earlier. So this refers to things that you were taught in school, not explicitly taught. And it links to the Marxist concept of the correspondence principle, which was Bolzingenius, what we spoke about earlier. So an example is that students are taught the value of extrinsic rewards, such as for exams, so that when they go into the workplace, they are willing to stay at the job for the money, rather than intrinsic value of the job. So if you don't know what that means, basically the intrinsic value is like, I love my job, I love doing this. Like, so for example, you've become a singer because you love singing, whereas some people might become a singer because they're good at it and you get good money, but they might not necessarily like it. That probably wasn't the best example, but anyways, we'll move on. Arguably, the hidden curriculum is no longer hidden. For example, we learn about it in sociology, which is really ironic. Also, not all students conform, thinking back to Paul Willis's Learning to Labour. So like now we're talking about the hidden curriculum. If it was so hidden, we wouldn't be discussing it. So, yeah. Next, we have labelling. Labelling theory suggests that teachers judge pupils not by their ability or intelligence, but by characteristics such as appearance, gender, behaviour, class, and ethnicity. Interactionalists argue that individuals develop a low self-concept or view themselves based on how others react to them. So this refers to Cooley's concept of the looking glass self. So this refers to how pupils interact with teachers and fellow students can shape their identities, which can in turn influence their educational attainment. So if a teacher says, oh, you're really bad at maths, oh, you can't do that, oh, that was too hard for you, oh, you're so bad, you need to do better, you'll soon internalise that and go, wait, maybe I am bad at maths and maybe I'll never do well and I can't get better. And this links into the self-fulfilling prophecy. So a self-fulfilling prophecy is a process where labelling someone in a certain way causes them to live up to a label and fulfill the prophecy made about them. And this links to Rosenthal and Jacobson's Pygmalion in the Classroom study. This again is another case study that it'd be good if you're aware of. So it's a field experiment taking place in an elementary school in the USA. 20% of the students were randomly selected and labelled as intellectual spurters. So basically the teachers were told, right, these are the clever kids. These are the ones that are going to excel, where actually they were just randomly selected. There was no evidence behind it, but the teachers weren't aware of that. And eventually, when they re-evaluated the children's progress, at the end of the year, the prophecy was in fact fulfilled, with that 20% group making higher than average progress than what they would have done, but also compared to the other students. A criticism is that IQ tests are a poor way to measure ability, and teachers are not observed in the classroom. So interactionalists, thinking of your research methods, would argue that there's no in-depth understanding, which is also known as the stone. So yeah, we have the stats of, well, look, they improved a cause and effect relationship, they were given this label and they fulfilled it. But we don't know the finer details of why this happened. Next, we have setting and streaming. So a setting is where individuals are placed into sets based on their ability and differ across subjects, whereas streaming refers to splitting pupils into groups based on their ability, which they stay in across all subjects. So setting, you might be in bottom set maths, top set English, whereas streaming is that you're the same across all your subjects. Setting and streaming has become more of the norm in schools because of marketisation. Competition between and within schools helps to normalise it. Parents, students and teachers accept it as part of meritocracy. And this links on to Gilborn and Udall's educational triage. So as we can see by this beautiful diagram here, a pupil gets labelled by a teacher and they are then triaged. So triage, three different stages. First one being those who will pass anyways and can be ignored. So, your A-star students, yeah, they're clever, they'll revise at home. We don't need to worry about them. You've got the ones that will fail and can be ignored. They don't try at all, they're a lost cause, we can't help them. And then you have the borderline pupils who can be helped and might succeed if they have a little bit of help and intervention. Criticisms of this is that there's lower teacher expectations on students in the lower streams, which might prevent them from climbing into the other higher sets. I couldn't think of a better way to word that. And it also leads to labelling and increased stigma. Reduced access to opportunities, so they might not be entered for example, higher exams might be limited to the foundation level. And there's a difficulty in removing labels. So if a student is being placed in the bottom, it's hard for them to overcome that and say, I can actually get out of this group, I can go into the next set, for example, because it's so ingrained into you. Again, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy of, I'm not good enough. Okay, so next we have the ideal pupil. This refers to the student profile teachers implicitly hold in their minds representing their expectations of a model student. So, for example, a teacher might be like, ooh, the best student is one that hands in their homework every week, concentrates on lesson, contributes, things like that. Developing this further, we have Gilborn and Udall, who studied 2 London secondary schools, in which they found that working class pupils were more likely to be seen as disruptive, ill-prepared and demotivated, whereas middle class pupils were more likely to be seen as cooperative, well-prepared and motivated. So this often led to working class students typically being in lower sets, with middle class students dominating the higher sets. Looking at this study, it lacks representativeness because it was purely based on 2 schools in London, so it's only micro scale. But it was an observation and it had interviews giving greater understanding, which was the staying again, and increased validity. Then we have subcultures. A pupil subculture is a group of peoples that share similar norms, values, and patterns of behaviour. Lacey argues that these develop through differentiation and polarisation. Pro-school subcultures gain status in academic success, whereas anti-school subcultures must find alternate means to gain status. So here we have another diagram, loving these. So differentiation, teachers positively or negatively label students. Polarisation, students react to their label, they adopt 2 opposite poles or extremes. So that's your pro subculture or your anti-school subculture. I don't have time to go into the individual subcultures, but ones that I would recommend looking at is, so for your African Caribbean male subcultures, Sewell study. Black female subcultures, you have Fuller's study. White female subcultures, Ringrose. White male working class subcultures, again, Paul Willis. Get him in as much as you can, honestly. An AO3 of this is Mackengale found that there are different types of working class male subcultures, and he found there was 4 different types. So having Paul Willis homogenising them, there's actually 4 different types, which he found were academic achievers, macho lads, new enterprisers, and real Englishmen. Again, take your time to look into those subcultures. So, moving on to topic number 6 is social class and education. First, we're going to look at material deprivation. So, material deprivation is the inability to afford basic resources, which can impact a pupil's educational achievement. Pupils are unable to afford things like sufficient food, heating, or clothing and educational resources, which leads to underachievement. Some key stats you should know are that 33% of children in receipt of free school meals gained 5 or more A-star to C grades, compared to 61% of students who are not on free school meals. Middle-class children have a reading age of about 2.5 years ahead of working-class students by the age of 15, and also 90% of Ofsted rated failing schools are in deprived areas. This consequently can lead to silk shifting, where schools may offer working-class students who threaten the school's position on league tables. Housing. The quality of housing a pupil lives in can affect achievement in schools, such as child development can be impaired through a lack of outdoor space for safe play and exploration. Living in temporary accommodation may involve having to move frequently, resulting in constant changes in school and disruption to education. Families in temporary accommodation also suffer from more psychological distress. Children in crowded homes run a greater risk of accidents, such as cold or damp accommodation can also cause health and respiratory issues. Overcrowding means less room for educational activities, so nowhere to do homework, disturbed sleeping from either sharing a bed or sharing a room, etc. Okay, so Howard looks at poverty and poor diets, saying that children from poor homes have lower intakes of vitamins and minerals, which may result in more absences from school, which is more lesson time missed, and when they actually are in lessons, they might have a lower level of concentration. Bull discusses the cost of education. The lack of financial support means that children from poor families have to go without equipment and miss out on experiences such as like abroad school trips and things like that would enhance their educational achievements, and this is known as the hidden cost of free education. Looking at universities, we have the Oxford dropout rate. So 16.6% of students drop out of the London Metropolitan University, compared to a low of 1.5% at Oxford. However, if we look at the types of students that attend Oxford University, over 50% of Oxford students come from private education. And from this, we can imply that richer upper-class families can provide a better quality of education for their child, meaning they're more likely to fulfill their degree. Callender and Jackson discussed the fear of debt. I don't know why I even said that. They found that working-class students are more debt-adverse and saw debt as a negative. Also, some saw more cons, I should say, than benefits going to uni. The more debt-adverse students were over 5 times less likely to apply than the most debt-tolerant students. The government has tried to compensate for students from low-income backgrounds with things like education maintenance allowance, as we discussed, and then you have your bursaries, pupil premium, and for uni students you have your student loans. But again, if you look at the criticism from education policy, you'll see that those things don't always work. Okay, so now we're going to look at cultural deprivation. This is the concept that working class families fail to primary socialise their children adequately. Bernstein argues that speech patterns of those at the bottom of the class system are inferior. He referred to the speech codes of the working class as restricted, while the middle/upper class being elaborate. This benefits middle-class students as a teacher speaks it, the exams are written in it, textbooks use it, and they are rewarded for using it, such as in your speaking exams. However, this disadvantages the working class as they become alienated in the classroom, which could also lead to negative labelling. So, looking at this, Bernstein recognises the role of school in influencing underachievement. The school fails to teach students how to use elaborate code. Rather than teaching them, they actually discipline them. And however, Bernstein devalues working class speech as inadequate when it works in their own habitus. So we have Bernstein. Habitus is actually coined by Bordeaux, I believe, but anyways, habitus refers to norms, values, attitudes, and behaviours of a particular social group or class. So, evaluating cultural deprivation and building on it further, should I say, working class attitudes and values play a role. So, according to cultural deprivation theorists, a large section of the working classes have different goals, beliefs, and attitudes and values from mainstream society. Working class children internalise the beliefs of their often deviant subcultures and underachievement. Working class jobs require less skills, are less secure, and have fewer promotions with wages peaking early. Sugarman refers to four main aspects of this: fatalism, so again think of your learning to labour; collectivism, immediate gratification, so that's rather than putting work in hard for exams. So for example, like A levels, you go, oh, it's 2 years away, like that's too far. And when I get my qualifications, I have to get a job. They just seek it now, so they might be more likely to go straight into employment. And again, present time orientation, it's thinking out the now. Oh well, I need the money now. Like rather than building a career that might get you a high paid job, it's like, well, I need it now. I go into employment now. Criticisms. Keddy believes that cultural deprivation is victim blaming. Working class culture is in fact just different and not deprived, but because it's seen as inferior and makes it believe this way. Working class failure is down to the systematic discrimination within a middle class education environment. So then again, it's the favourite of the middle class, and it's tailored towards their needs, excluding the working class. Schools fail to challenge middle class bias in terms of language bias and negative labelling. Working class parents are intimidated by working class school environments, and less working class engagement with school partly attribute to irregular work patterns and shift work. So parents might not be able to go to parents' evenings and things like that, or like open evenings, because they simply can't be there because of work. Okay, so I think I alluded to this earlier, but of course we have cultural capital. So here's Bordeaux. Capital is something useful to help you achieve your goals in a particular group or society. So you have cultural, educational, and economic capital. Cultural capital is knowledge of values, attitudes, tastes, abilities, and language of the dominant culture of society. The dominant culture is normally the middle class culture, hence working class culture is devalued and education as rough and inferior. Middle class families have more cultural capital because they know how to help their children with homework, can relate to teachers, so they're more likely to contact teachers with questions and complaints. They feel comfortable doing research and might be more likely to read things like Ofsted reports. They have the money to move to different catchment areas. We think again 90% Ofsted film schools in the private areas. And they can see the importance of high culture and wider learning, so they might take the kids on museum trips or give them music lessons or go on holidays abroad to experience different cultures. However, cultural capital has accounted for some of the class differences in attainment. While working class children had equal amounts of cultural capital, some middle class children did better because of high levels of economic capital and aspirations. So an example of this is 7% of children in the UK are educated in private schools, receiving both the best education and educational capital. So we can't look at cultural capital alone. There's always something more to it. Topic 7. We have gender and inequality in education. Females outperform relative to males because schools are too feminised, coursework favours girls, female friends are more likely to be part of pro-school subcultures, and if you look at like the March of Progress, women have more opportunities now than ever, and girls are more pressured to do well in their A-levels or GCSEs, with 60% of parents thinking it was important for their daughters to go to university. Reasons why males might underperform in comparison to females because the lack of male role models, they're good at practical tasks, and they are more likely to be part of anti-school subcultures with lower expectations placed on them. So if you look at here, we can see like at the lowest point in 1989, which was when the Education Reform Act was first introduced, there was only a 4-point gap between boys and girls' achievements. This increased to a 9% gap in about the 2000s, then decreased to 7, and now it's increased to about 9 again. So there is a gap between learning. But again, we can see that both genders have increased a lot. So the first thing we're going to look at is the feminisation of the school environment. Epstein argues that there is a poor boys discourse that blames the school environment for the failure of boys. 90% of primary school teachers are female, meaning that there is a lack of positive role models for boys, meaning that the environment becomes alienating. And there's a belief that teachers don't understand masculinity and provide girls with more attention. However, it can be argued otherwise, as Abraham argues that deviant boys receive more attention from some teachers. Mitsos and Brown argue that teachers are less critical of boys than girls, and more female teachers and female leaders act as a role model for girls. Girls also produce work timely, of high standard and well presented, and boys are the opposite, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Again, linking back to that. Marketisation and league tables have seen schools trying to recruit more girls that outperform boys and exclude more boys who underperform, ultimately just to make them look better, really. So, criticisms of this. Carrington argues that there is a little evidence of a link between the teacher's gender and male outcomes. Reid studied the use of discipline by over 50 male and female primary school teachers. Both were as likely to use male discipline discourse, authority, which is like authoritarian, loud and sarcastic characteristics. Schools also remain very patriarchal still. May this be due to the competitiveness, the hierarchical structures, so you might be more likely to have like a male principal, whereas like the teachers might be female, for example. And they're also sexist. There's no nice way to put that, really. So, for example, girls' bodies and uniforms are more tightly controlled, for example, skirts. The pressure placed on girls also makes them more vulnerable to things like eating disorders, self-harm, and depression. And girls for all levels of education, whether it be primary or university, unfortunately, they are still victims of sexual assault. And if you're interested, you can go on the Everyone's Invited website, which is basically a place where people can upload their testimonies and experiences within the educational system, but also other aspects of society where they have faced either sexual assaults or things of that area. Then you have the impacts of subject choice. So this is at university, so you can see that men are more likely to go into careers such as engineering, computing, maths, and things like that, whereas females are more likely to go into veterinary science, psychology, humanities, and things like that. Skelton and Francis argue that there are considerable differences between boys and girls in subject choice at A-level. Boys follow technical and science-based courses, whilst girls follow caring subjects such as arts, humanities, and social sciences, as we can see here. Females end up in relatively lower paid and lower status jobs as a result. However, looking at the other side of this, more women are now entering and studying medicine, dentistry, and law than men. So, when looking at subject choice, they're often highly influenced by our teachers, parents, and our peer groups and how they steer us towards subjects that are deemed acceptable for our genders. So, subjects that females are drawn to are mostly taught by women with discursive teaching styles, whereas subjects that males are drawn to are mostly taught by men with more traditional teaching styles. However, it's found that in single-sex schools, the subject choice gap is narrowed, showing the importance of peer pressure and teacher labelling on subject choice. So, for example, it was found that in single-sex schools, girls are 2.5 more times likely to choose physics at A-level compared to a mixed-sex school. Science is seen as a boys' subject because science teachers are more likely to be men. The examples teachers and textbooks use are often drawn towards boys' interests. So, for example, like, it just makes me think of like in physics where like, oh, Ronaldo kicked the football at so-and-so, whatever, work out the force. I don't know. I remember I had to do that. It just sticks out in my mind. And also in science lessons, boys dominate the laboratory, so they might be causing havoc, basically, smashing things, turning the Bunsen burners all the way up. You know how it is. Criticisms of this are the underachievement of boys is ultimately a moral panic, and it's been amplified by press on rioting and gang violence that underachieving boys go into and become involved in. But obviously, not everyone becomes a gang member. And it also ignores other factors such as social class, which has a 5 times more impact, and ethnicity, which has twice the impact on educational outcomes. And now we have reached the final topic, ethnicity and inequality in education. Cultural deprivation is the first one we're going to look at. Ethnic minorities can be held back with a lack of reasoning skills, a lack of problem solving, as well as poor language skills. For example, spoken and written communication can be ungrammatical, disjointed, and lack abstraction due to them speaking their restricted code. However, if you look at this like bar chart, that's what it is, right? Here, you can see that Chinese, Indian, and Bangladeshi students are outperforming white British students and above the national average. So therefore, that just proves that theory wrong. Back with my beautiful diagrams, we have Moynihan's vicious cycle of cultural deprivation. So you start at the top, and it's the idea that children are inadequately primarily socialised. This means that they fail at school, then they go into not valuing education, and ultimately they become inadequate parents. You can tell we're getting towards the end because I like to make like bubbles and stuff to make it exciting. So, fatalism. Black students are more confident to place success or failure in exams down to the teachers or the exam questions, neglecting their agency or free will to affect the outcomes of exams. Family setup. Over 50% of Afro-Caribbean families are lone parent, with 90% of them being matrifocal, which basically means that they're headed by a woman. This can lead to financial struggles, which links to the hidden cost of free education. A lack of a father figure means a lack of role models in terms of achievement. So they say, like, if like a white middle class individual has their father present at the home and he is a business owner, for example, then you can look up to that and be like, oh, I'm going to be like my dad, I want to own my own business. But if you don't have that person to look up to, you might not have those aspirations. And also a lack of a disciplinarian slash instrumental male might lead to misbehaviour at school. And as Patricia Morgan, new right speaker, says, single parent families breed delinquents. So this links to that. Price argues that the new right blames black underachievement due to a lack of male role models, failure to embrace meritocratic British culture, so again with the idea of fatalism over here, and less resistance to racism, and a lack of self-esteem leads to failure. Okay, so I alluded to this earlier when we were talking about subcultures, but we have Sewell and his findings into black male failure. So he blames it to a lack of tough love and a lack of a father figure. So again, it's that authoritarian, disciplined figure in their life, which they lack. It's also blamed on street and gang culture, which offers an alternative form of love and status for anti-school subcultures. And this also links in with peer pressure. So, evaluating this, Driver argues that it ignores the positive effects of ethnicity on achievement. The single-parent matriarchal family empowers black girls and leads to better outcomes. Lawrence argues Price is wrong. Black pupils underachieve because of racism in education and not because of low self-esteem. This again could link to victim blaming because they're actually victims of institutional racism rather than having just a low self-esteem. Keddy argues that BAME children are culturally different and not culturally deprived. Schools are ethnocentric and they adhere to the dominantly white curriculum. So here we've got 11% of GCSE modules reference black history, but also some of those could be negative representations, so they aren't always positive. So it could be like white colonialism, the slave trade. It isn't exactly empowering. And so ethnocentric means that the running of schools is done in a way that supports the majority ethnic perspective, which is white British. Okay, so we discussed this earlier, material deprivation, but this is looking at it from an ethnic perspective. So, BAME members of society are more likely to face material deprivation. For example, 50% of BAME children live in low-income households versus 25% of white children. BAME unemployment doubled that of the white community. Bangladeshi and Pakistani workers are twice as likely to be on the minimum wage than a white counterpart. BAME communities are more likely to work shift patterns, so this could be night shifts, and this means that there's less time to discuss issues on a dinner table. So say if a child is struggling at school, they don't have the opportunity to tell their parents because they simply aren't seeing them. And they also receive less help with homework or cultural capital activities such as museum visits because the parent is obviously going to be catching up sleep and doing all the things they need to do at home whilst they could be doing them. And also, parents may miss parents' evenings or opening evenings, things like that. And it can also impact sleep patterns, causing a lack of concentration at schools. Again, live more likely to live in deprived areas. This links to the Ofsteds, more likely to be failing schools, leading to anti-school subcultures. And overseas qualifications are less valued or recognised by employees affecting the children of migrants. Asylum seekers are usually not allowed to work. So this could drive fatalism into children if parents have worked hard at schools overseas, but yet their qualifications are not recognised by the UK industries. Because they might be like, well, my parents put all in that hard work and there's nothing to show for it, so I might as well not work hard. So we've reached our last slide, which is racism and wider society. Ultimately, education is racist because society is racist. Education is just an institution as part of this big system. So, again, you have institutional racism because of this. Poverty or material deprivation is often caused or made worse by racism, with Rex arguing that discrimination in housing often drives ethnic minorities into substandard accommodation in deprived areas and poor housing. So we can link this back to material deprivation when we looked at it from class, all the troubles of the housing and things like that has on a person. Wood argues that discrimination is in employment leads to ethnic minorities leads to ethnic minorities to low paid work or unemployment. Ethnic minorities were 50% less likely to receive an interview for a job compared to a white person, which has a lack of upward mobility. Catchment areas again offset the 90%. Connolly argues that class, gender, and ethnicity overlap in different ways with different students. We overestimate the importance of material deprivation compared to cultural deprivation. Indian Chinese students who are materially deprived still outperform middle-class white children, with 86% of female Chinese students on free school meals achieve 5 A-star to C grades compared to 65% of female white students not in receipt of free school meals. So we have reached the end. I don't think I did bad trying to stick to an hour, but I just wanted to say if you've got this far, thank you so much. I'm sorry if this hasn't been the best thing because it's the first I've ever done a video like this, and it is weird talking to a camera when you're not used to it. But stay tuned for more videos. I'll definitely do the research methods and theory, and I do intend to do paper 2. So for paper 2, I do family and media, so that's what I'll be doing the videos on. Obviously, it's options, yours might be different, and our beliefs in society is a popular one. And then your paper 3 of your crime, and I can also do other videos. So leave suggestions in the comments, but also improvements of how I can improve because I'm sure this isn't perfect. But again, thank you for watching and bye.